A very warm welcome to you all from all around the world. My name is Mark Williamson, and it is fantastic to see you all here for another live Action for Happiness event, part of this amazing community of people taking action for a happier and kinder world together. If it's your first time, thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic topic today, resilience and healing. And thank you especially to those of you who've been part of this community for many years, helping to spread these ideas and contribute to a happier and kinder world. I'm so excited that today we're joined by Anjuli Sherin. Anjuli, thank you for being here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark, and thank you to everybody for showing up. I'm a big fan of Action of Happiness, so it's wonderful to be here live with the community.
Oh, thank you. And I know I was delighted to hear that you've been participating in our content and ideas and actions and so on for some time. So maybe we could explore that a bit later on. But just to set the scene for all of you who are joining, please do use the chat function as always, and let's keep it kind and relevant and supportive, as I know you always do. Please do also use the Q&A and post any questions you'd like to ask Anjuli about this fascinating and so important topic of resilience. She and I are going to have a conversation together for about half an hour, then there'll be a chance to hear from you, but we're also going to make this interactive as well along the way. So really looking forward to, as ever, hearing all of your views as well. But Anjuli, I wondered, could we start maybe with you telling us a little bit about your background as a therapist and of course now an author as well of this great new book, Joyous Resilience. So I guess a little bit about your experience, but also particularly why this topic and what it means to you personally.
Thank you. Yeah, let's see. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, a somatic coach, hypnotherapist, and a teacher on the issues of trauma healing, joy, resilience, emotional self-regulation, and boundary setting. And that all sits inside of, first and foremost, I am a client and a human being. And that's really why I'm a member of the Action of Happiness community, because for the past couple of decades, I feel really privileged and honored to have been able to engage in my own personal transformation. I'm an immigrant from Pakistan to America. I came over in my late teens and began therapy in my early 20s. And I think, like I said, that really was the biggest privilege and really needed it in my early 20s, continue to need it, especially not really knowing at that age and, moving countries, leaving behind family, coming from a culture that has a lot of patriarchy. I mean, every culture has its thing, and that was fine. Learning how to know what in the world I was feeling inside, how to actually know what was happening in my emotions, learning how to handle anger or grief or sadness, and really how they were acting out in my relationships. That was the crux of where it began. So it began as a very personal place of I'm not really able to have what I want, whether it was in university or whether it was in my personal relationships. And just learning how to articulate that I have these sensations in my body and they actually are telling me something about what I'm feeling, which is telling me something about what I'm needing, which I could then articulate to the people in my life and begin to actually have healthy relationship instead of loss. That's a long-winded way of saying, like, at the base, that was probably the most empowering thing that happened in my early 20s and set me up for this is the work that I want to do. And then gradually over time translated into if we want to have relationships with each other in a way that actually does help them thrive. And then as I grew older, if we want to have a world in which we can thrive, it really does begin with that oxygen mask on first. That oxygen mask looks like knowing what's happening inside and instead of being in conflict with it or at a loss over it, to actually know how to respond and tune to it, and then bring that same responsiveness to each other. So all of that has been kind of my personal journey, and then a lot of my work with clients over the years. I'm an individual therapist and a group therapist, especially because we heal in relationship, and we're wounded in relationship, we heal in relationship. And it was all of that work, and then later on a focus on joy that came into the book, Joyous Resilience, which I know we'll talk more about today.
Thank you. That's really, well, it's lovely to hear your story, but I think it shows why you're exactly the right person to be speaking to today about this topic. I guess resilience, Anjuli, is something that we feel we always need, and the world is always full of challenges and suffering, and yet somehow it feels that right now we're dealing with a lot wherever we are in the world, actually, whether that's at a big picture societal level or indeed in the sort of day-to-day challenges that so many people are facing. Do you feel that too? I mean, that resilience is both sort of timeless and yet also particularly needed right now.
Yes, I mean, I was thinking about that this morning coming to this talk and like the model that I'm going to walk people through. And I was thinking of examples to share with people about like, because again, I think when you write a book or you sit, in this forum, I think that we tend to forget like we're all human beings. And I don't know anybody who's not hurting in one way or the other, whether personally or collectively right now. And so, whether it was as simple as feeling nervous, so I'll always like to out myself feeling nervous about getting on this talk, which is a very tiny thing, but when you're coming on a talk, it's like, okay, that was my nervous system today. Or whether it was the immense amount of grief and sadness I know a lot of people are holding about what's happening in the Middle East all of this week and sitting with clients. Or whether it is, I think you and I are talking, Mark, about like continuing to handle like post-COVID world and climate change. Like there's just so much happening. And I think that is where the idea of resilience that I want to talk about is not so much, I think sometimes in the media or in popular discourse, people think resilience means it doesn't affect me or I'm so strong, I can just power through it, and actually the resilience I want to talk about is not necessarily some innate trait that lets you just move through and not actually feel. So not grit, quote unquote. And not even necessarily a process like, oh, if I meditate or I exercise and I'm more resilient. Those certainly processes help. It's a way of attuning to that deep vulnerability that we're in that actually lets that vulnerability feel held and responded to. That's what lets us feel regulated and co-regulated. And hopefully that'll make more sense as I walk through the model.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to, sorry to interrupt. I'm really looking forward to going through, I guess, the core model in the book, because you're going to talk, I think, initially about how we kind of think about suffering, but also then particularly how we can build this, I think, what you call the circle of resilience. But I wondered, Anjuli, before we go there, just in a light touch way, I think we're not going to try and jump off a cliff here with everyone, but I'd love to hear from the community. And as you say, everyone's dealing with something. So maybe we could just take a moment, wherever you are right now, stop what you're doing and just tune into how you're feeling right now, what you're bringing to this lovely conversation today. And if you would like to just share in the chat in just a few words, something that's perhaps a challenge or a source of suffering or something that's on your mind right now, I'd love to hear from you in the community. And maybe that's something that Anjuli and I can then build on in the conversation we have together. So let's just get a sense of what we're bringing here today. So I'll just read a few of these out as they come past, Anjuli. Personal future. My dad just passed away. I'm so sorry to hear that. Stress. The war in Israel and Gaza, grief, fear, chronic pain, alienated from children, family conflict, self-critical inner thoughts, burnout, too much change, my job, betrayal, managing chronic fatigue, bullying in the past, inflation, relationship breakup, uncertainty, confusion, work pressures, futility, a friend dealing with dementia. So I'll pause there. Thank you so much, first of all, everyone, for sharing that. And I missed out lots and lots of what was coming past there, but I feel both slightly overwhelmed by that, but also a huge sense of, I think you said kind of like, we're all human, that kind of idea that this is a common struggle that we have in our lives.
That's right. And I mean, thank you everybody for your tremendous vulnerability. As hard as it is to share, or maybe even can be flooding, I think it's also really co-regulating to be able to just say and have it reflected back that you are not alone. I mean, again, fundamental source of resilience is connection, which is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for this platform and so grateful for everybody kind of joining in, is like it begins to heal instantly when we know we're not secretly in our homes and then judging ourselves for these feelings we're having, imagining that everybody else on social media is having wonderful lives, as opposed to, I'm sure we also have a lot of beauty and love in our lives, and there is pain, and that is normal. I mean, it is sad, but it also bonds us. And that's what I hope this talk will do, is go, resilience is about sharing in that and caring for that versus bypassing or not having pain. It's how we are with pain that actually is the source of our resilience. And thank you, and me too, and just sending you all a lot of love.
Yeah, and just building on what you said there, it was really nice to see people appreciating hearing from each other and the sort of bravery being shared there. Let's come to that first part of your book then about suffering, and maybe you could say a bit more about what we sort of mean by and how we relate to suffering. But one thing I picked up in your work is this idea that we have some sort of learned responses. Maybe you could say a bit more about that and whether that's helpful or unhelpful and how we kind of relate to suffering.
Absolutely. So the book is divided into a two-part model. And the first part is the cycle of suffering. Second part is circle of resilience. And as I walk you all through the cycle of suffering, that thing that you all brought up, unless it feels really intense, and if it does, then choose something a little bit lower level, including just being here in this conversation and what it might be bringing up. So cycle of suffering begins with what I call our vulnerable self. And that's the part of you and me. That's the part of me that showed up a bit anxious today. And I can kind of feel her in my heart and a little bit in my tummy, sort of like a hiccup. So that vulnerable self is always talking to us through our sensations and our emotions, cueing us through those. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling a little bit sad. I'm feeling a bit despair. I'm feeling a bit anxious, a bit irritated. And it's really what happens next that makes a difference. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times from family of origin, and again, with a lot of care to family of origin, because family of origin is also sitting inside of further back family of origins, culture, history, how we were taught to respond to feelings and sensations. But oftentimes what gets passed on is if I'm having this feeling, there's two things that might happen. One is what I call the critic. So here's a vulnerable self, and then in the cycle of suffering, here's a critic who's pointing a finger. And so, for example, if I'm feeling anxious today, this would be the voice that might come in this morning or yesterday and say things like, well, other people don't get anxious. You know, what's wrong with you? I'm sure other speakers never felt that way. If you were prepared, it would be better. So really that kind of like putting down or critique. Criticism can also show up as like a guise of like perfectionism, which can sound benign. Like, I just want you to do the best you can. And in fact, when Mark and I were talking, he helped my perfectionist because I remember he said to me last week, you know, you've got this, you've written the book, you don't need to spend your weekend planning and all of this. But if I hadn't let that in, it would be so easy to be, you know, constantly ruminating and thinking about how do I make this even better? So perfectionism, criticism, fear mongering. So it's going to go really bad. What's the worst that's going to happen? Catastrophizing. As I say these, and I'll slow down just a little bit because there's a lot in what I said in that, please take a moment and just think about, are any of these three faces of the critic, just the regular critic pointing a finger, the perfectionist, or the fear monger, at all at play today when it comes to this vulnerable feeling you are feeling? I'll give you just a moment. So then, as you can imagine,
would it be helpful if I shared what I'm thinking as well?
I'll pause. Mark, I can't actually hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
No, I can.
Yeah,
yes.
I was just saying, I wonder if it might be helpful for me to do this live so people can sort of see. So I guess what came up for me then doing what you suggested was I'm feeling in a bit of a rush today. And so my kind of like critic is saying, oh, you've just kind of like not given enough time to all the different things that needed. You haven't kind of been there for enough time for people. You're rushing around. You're being a bit too kind of unfocused. That's kind of like my inner critic today.
Totally. Oh, totally, exactly. And then I guess what I would ask you is, and everybody else is, before we get to the next phase, what happens to the vulnerable self? Because there is a part that's probably feeling a bit anxious, right? Because, okay, I'm in a rush. But when it's met with that voice, does the feeling of anxiety rise, go away? What actually happens?
I find when I hear that voice, I feel like I feel that sense of it's not quite overwhelmed, but like I feel like I'm letting people down, and I'm not kind of doing things as well as they could be done, and so that feels hard to hear and hard to cope with. So yeah,
that's right. And thank you also, Mark, for being so vulnerable with me. It's very beautiful, and I'm touched. And I totally resonate with that. So what you just showed us, though, is that what began as an initial anxiety, right? Like, okay, I'm rushing a pickup. When responded to then with the critic, actually turned into, I don't know if this word would fit for you, but I think a bit like trying to collapse a bit, or go into disappointment, or despair is very strong, but like disappointment, shame, despair. This is like where it can go for people, right? Because now I'm being told I'm bad for what I'm feeling. And as you can see, the cycle of suffering, we're just in one part of the cycle. The cycle is starting to go around because now I started off with a smaller feeling and it actually spiraled into a deeper feeling. So then what can happen next? Here's the other face in this cycle, and that is the neglector. And the neglector, if the critic is this finger pointing thing, the neglector is this turning away. Again, with a lot of care for this part, it's just trying to deal with that pain that's coming up by going, there's three phases again. One would be the world is on fire. There's a lot to do. I'm fine. I don't need to take, let me just focus on other people and other things. So, which can be kind of useful if I'm feeling rushed and despair and kind of bad about myself. Let me just zoom out, right? So we start to get away from our inner feeling by focusing on, and all of us have this, there's plenty going on in our worlds to let us know that we don't need our own attention. So much is being demanded of us. So the one phase can be we neglect ourselves for the sake of the larger. Second phase can be people pleasing. And this can be a little bit more about if I'm having a feeling, let's say I'm maybe a bit irritated, or maybe I'm feeling rushed because this is not about you, Mark, just given as an example. Maybe I'm rushed because I am overstretched because I have had a lot of asks and I'm constantly saying yes, because it's really hard or scary to be able to say no. So people pleasing, saying everything's fine, constantly putting ourselves last, all of that can also begin to heighten this feeling inside, even though temporarily it can feel like a relief because I don't have to deal with the difficulty of saying no and disappointing somebody, or the fear of losing the connection, or whatever it is that's been giving us by neglecting ourselves. And the last one, this is my favorite of choice, would have been, me going distraction. So, and this is benign, but we all get into it. Like, let me just endlessly scroll or read my books, that I love, or my shows, and try to get away from this feeling inside that is the original anxiety. So the neglector basically tries to turn its head away. It can sometimes produce a temporary relief. Unfortunately, at 2 a.m. at night, or the next day, or at some point, that feeling, the vulnerable self, is still there. And then is up at night going, what did I do? Why was I rushed? Oh, I'm so bad. Oh my gosh, like I said yes again. Now I'm feeling more rushed about tomorrow. So the cycle continues. And next, I'm going to point my finger at myself more. I'm going to feel worse. And the point is that it never ends. And it really never ends because the way that it's being responded to, unfortunately, elevates the vulnerable self instead of actually tending to it. And again, I'll pause in case people connected with any of the faces of the neglector. Again, distraction.
Well, I really connect with the people pleaser part that you mentioned. It's something I like to think of myself these days as a recovering people pleaser, Anjuli. But I think, and for many parts of my life, I guess that ability to see what others need and to meet their needs and to get the reward of like being told I'd done well.
That's right.
Has been served me well, but it's actually been really, when it comes to things like resilience and inner critic and the things you've been talking about, it's not served me well because I've been my psychological health has been too much at the whim of whether or not I've been acknowledged and appreciated, and I maybe the example I gave earlier about feeling like I was letting people down is still connected to that. So that's one that really resonates with me.
That's right. That's really helpful. And I think you nailed the heart of it. Actually, I would say generally for people pleasing. And again, all of us have that because all of us want to be loved. If you think about it, that vulnerable self, that inner part, of course, it wants to feel loved and nurtured. It's just that the ways that we learn to get it is like you said, okay, now I'll give myself up for other people. And then unfortunately, I might get the hit of they said good job, but inside I'm getting more and more exhausted and depleted and probably at some point resentful. And so I'm not really getting that true love that goes, your needs matter too. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's very, very common. And also, I hope it helps us give compassion to both of these parts, critic and neglector, because they're actually trying to help. The critic is usually trying to motivate, quote unquote, through criticism, except that the result usually is not motivation. It's a decline in self-esteem and confidence. The neglector is trying to get love, usually, some kind of ease. But the cost is really high. But we really want to give compassion to the learning of these and their original intention.
I really love that point, because what you're really saying, I think, if I've understood you, is that these habits we have in these sort of cycles of suffering are well-meaning in that they're trying to protect us. They have a very understandable cause in difficult situations. They're sort of protective. And yet, as you pointed out, they have this slightly destructive, or they can lead into spirals of unhappiness, I guess. So maybe it's a good time to move on to your circle of resilience and how we could move forward from there.
That's right. So yes, so with a lot of compassion, actually, that's where we start in the circle of resilience. So circle of resilience has 4 players: the nurturer, the protector, the soul self, and the resilient self. And I always start with the nurture, and that's not an accident because it's the biggest base. Like if I was going to say, let's leave with an action step after this talk, I would first and foremost ask people to check where are your skill sets around nurturance. And I'll break that down in a moment, because without that foundation of unconditional kindness, acceptance, and curiosity towards oneself, it's really hard to do the rest of it. Protection, setting boundaries, all of that. So it starts with, if the neglector is going like this to your vulnerable self, the nurturer is that classic gesture of parent to child, like I am looking towards. And it's what I said to you all, in my early 20s, when I learned, okay, I'm going to put my hands on my body. There's some sensations happening. That's me tuning to me. I'm going to learn to listen, to actually understand what they're trying to say. So the nurture is that skill of learning to identify our emotions, learning how to sit with ourselves with curiosity, learning to be able to bring our kindest selves, kind of being your own best friend. And in that, remembering that it's a lifelong journey. And I think I would also say, again, if you're a member of this community, and I believe this actually worldwide, you already have this inside of you. So this is not like some huge thing to get to. There's such kindness in this community already. And it was just accessing that part and using it to leverage, how do I begin to attune to myself? And you see me making this gesture a lot. We'll work with it in a moment. It's just that coming back hand on heart or arm around, going, tell me more. I'm here for you. So the nurturer begins to do that. And if you can imagine, this morning I got up and I put my hands on my body and I was like, oh, I see that you're nervous. Okay. And I just did a little rub inside. I was like, it's okay. Just talking to myself and acknowledging it. And then beginning to do some breathing and the things that I know help calm me down. But it was that first gesture of friendship versus the criticism that actually brings it down, because I know then that I'm safe with me. And I also remembered Mark's smile, and I remembered the Action of Happiness community. And so I regulated with the nurturing self, which is inside of all of you, going, I'm safe with these. These are kind people, which was a really wonderful way to regulate that nervous tension. So that's the first part of response in the circle of resilience. And I'll pause before I go on to the other things, because I see Mark. I'm like, what are you thinking, Mark?
Well, I'm thinking, I'm looking forward to hearing what the others are, but I know that you do have some interactive things that you use when working with clients. And I wondered if we could, as we've sometimes done in these events before, either now or when you perhaps finish talking about these different components, we could perhaps try this out together, and you can maybe take us through a short meditation. I know in the follow-up where you've kindly given some meditation exercises that we can share with everyone after the event to try developing some of these resilience techniques. But I feel like it would be lovely to experience that together at some point. What do you think?
I think that's great. And I'm going to let you choose. I can just walk people through the whole model, because what I want to actually see is, as I mentioned, the other three things are going to come up. And then we can take all those feelings that came up and actually use the nurturing response as a way to practice together, calming ourselves, if that's
great. Okay, well, why don't you talk us through the rest of the model then?
Okay, so let's say that you've tuned in inside, right? And like whatever this feeling is now, you're going, okay, what's happening? I'm here with you. Let me listen. Over time, as you develop that kindness and curiosity, the next self that we build. So in therapy, when I work with clients, once we really establish this, that's when we move into the protector. And the protector or champion is the antidote to the critic. And what the protector does is it translates all these feelings and sensations into boundaries. So for example, if you go back to our people-pleasing self, right? Now that people pleaser has turned as a nurturer and gone, what's happening? I actually want to pay attention to you. Oh, you're feeling rushed. Like, tell me more about that. What's got you rushed? And maybe I hear that it is because it was a little scary, but I kind of need to say no to a couple of things that came my way. It's the protector then who stands up and starts to learn how to say yes, no, and maybe, right? So our basic consent. The protector also learns how to translate this into needs. Maybe I actually also need to ask for help. Maybe I need someone else to take on some things. So cultivating a protector is crucial to joy and resilience, because all the nurturing in the world is going to help, but because we're in relationship and because we usually need things from other people, and that's part of being in community, we really need to know that it's safe for us to be able to say yes and no and still be loved by ourselves first and foremost, and then with each other, and that we know how to ask for help, give and receive clean requests, and also champion and celebrate ourselves. And those are the things that the protector does. The last and probably most important, the protector sets a boundary between the critic and the vulnerable self. And that's really that line where we go, neither I nor anybody else deserves to be talked to in these ways. The fear mongering and the criticism, right? So it's a real line, a loving line that we all need to have to feel safe inside. So nurture and protector are kind of basic and most important cornerstones of response as an antidote to critic and neglector. And then I'll pause because Mark, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I just what that's making me think is it's making me realize a couple of things that I guess I've developed as an antidote to my people-pleasing challenges I've had. And what one was, as you were just saying, that ability to say no, to have boundaries. And I found that really hard. I felt that saying no to people was sort of that they would think I was a bad person, or I didn't care, or I was being rude. And so learning to say no to things that I couldn't do, or I didn't have capacity for, but in a compassionate, friendly way, yes, in order to then have more energy and space for the things that really mattered. Finding a way to do that stayed true to my values was life-changing. It was like, oh, I can say no and still feel like I'm not letting people down. So that was amazing. But then you've just said something really interesting, which is, I don't think I was doing that internally. So I was still being quite hard on myself. So when I was able to say, no, you don't need to be that harsh on yourself. It's almost like internal boundaries as well. Like, don't be so mean to yourself. So I think that's coming over time and has got better as well. So thank you for helping me put language to those things.
I love it. And I mean, thank you for doing that work. Like, I feel like we don't talk about this enough with each other to actually permission each other to go, I want to hear your no, because your true no means that your yeses are even more real. And I know what you mean about it changed your life. I felt the same way. Like, I would never have thought it, that like the power of being able to say no and handle that I might be disappointing and feel safe actually freed me to love so much more and to feel so much more joy, because the yeses were really coming not from obligation and burden. And also, most of us find a way to say no. It's just that then it becomes passive aggressive, or like, flaking on people, or I'm going to drop things, and that's so much more painful for others than that clean, thank you so much, and I'm not able to do it. So we really do free each other. And I love that you did that work. And yeah, it is so much interesting to how to do it with yourself. So you have the nurturer, you have the protector, and now in the cycle of suffering, a third part is what I call the soul self. And if you noticed, there is no corresponding self in the vulnerable critic and neglector. And there's a reason, because when we're in the cycle of suffering, actually the world gets pretty narrow. I'm not sure if you all have noticed this, but I know for me, like when I'm in anxiety and fear or shame, it's kind of like I forget Anjuli, I forget larger history, I can forget community. It just really feels like I'm in this tiny little box and I'm in this terrible struggle and it's probably only me and I'm kind of going down. And so our worldview narrows, which unfortunately again exacerbates the cycle. But in the circle of resilience, when we do anything that's part of the soul self, so soul self is connecting to something larger than ourselves. And that can be as simple as, like, for me, when I go out in nature, I know that's very true for a lot of people. So when I step out of the house and I get into the trees or in landscape, and I'm with the birds, and I'm with the flowers, and all of a sudden they help co-regulate me into a different perspective. It can be service work and being a part of community and remembering, oh, there's a larger thing that I'm belonging to. Kind of like Action for Happiness platform, being a part of a larger community is a part of the soul self. Spirituality in like whatever way that works for you, creativity, music, anything that brings you awe, transcendence, that basically puts your brain into a space where creative solutions come. You have a long range perspective. People who love history and science, up my hand, just helps me hold sometimes very big current things that are happening inside of a larger arc. And that can sometimes help settle my system and remember we have gone through very painful times historically, for eons, and like how did others survive it, and how can we draw on that and continue to thrive? So the soul self helps tend to the vulnerable self by helping it sit in the lap of something much bigger. And I think we really need that these days, because a lot of what we're dealing with is not only intrapersonal or interpersonal, it's really collective. And I found for collective stuff, even to the climate crisis, going to Mother Nature helps me in some ways to have some more resilience or heart to deal with something as large as the grief around climate. So this is like a very important part of cultivating resilience, is cultivating that soul self. I see you again, Mark. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Thank you for listening so deeply.
Well, no, it's I love the insight here, and I agree that having a space to connect to, especially in nature, is an amazing source of support in challenging times. And I find that there's something about seeing the same things with new eyes is also a sort of source of resilience for me. And I find that being out in a natural space sort of helps me see the interconnectedness of things that puts my, it's not that it gets rid of my problems, that it sort of puts the whatever my worry is in a bit more wider context and makes
That's
me
right.
feel like I'm part of something bigger rather than just me dealing with my problems by myself.
That's right.
Um, I'd love us to move to doing something perhaps interactive to bring out this sort of sense of nurture and understanding. Maybe I know there's, because there's been a lot of information to take in as well. I wonder if you could perhaps take us into a slightly more meditative space and actually help us sort of whatever we brought to this in terms of our own challenges, maybe give us some practical ways to sort of develop that resilience that you've been talking about.
That's right. So I'll tie it all together, because what we're about to do now, kind of if you go back to that vulnerable self, and I mentioned there's a resilient self. The resilient self is simply the vulnerable self when they are tended to by a nurturer, a protector, a soul self, creativity, play, and pleasure. So as you can imagine, when you feel that way, anxious or sad or despair, and what we're about to do right now, just being attuned to knowing that there are boundaries, knowing that there's something larger to tap into, helps us feel like we can go forward. And move through something instead of getting buried underneath it. So that is the source of resilience. It's the profound response. So a couple of tiny ways to practice it together. And of course, like Mark said, you'll have a lot of resources at the end, both in the book and also some free meditations that will walk you through all of the stuff I did, and hopefully much more time. But for right now, it doesn't take that much. And so we'll begin with our first tool is attention. So take a moment and give yourself attention and just notice in the realm of sensation, especially, how are you? Notice if your breathing is shallow or deep, if there's tension in areas of the body or relaxation. Not changing anything quite yet, you're just giving yourself the gift of noticing. Are you heavy in any areas of the body or feeling light on the chair or in contact with the ground, however you are? Is it still inside, or are there places of movement or pickup? Again, not judging any of this, we're just giving attention, because attention is the first tool of nurturance and regulation. Just going, hi, I'm here. You've got my attention. And if you want, let's add in contact, because contact, if it feels right for you, actually releases oxytocin. It's also grounding. You notice me put my hand on my heart quite a bit, I'm sure. That can be a nice place, belly, wherever you're feeling this pickup. And for me, it's still, I'm excited, still a bit anxious, so I can feel it still in my heart and my belly a bit. So that's where I put my hands. And now we're going to use our second tool, very important one, portable, goes everywhere with us, your breath. And I'm going to invite you into a particular breath, which is a regulation breath pattern, which is, if you can, breathe into belly first, then chest, collarbone. And when you exhale, collarbone first goes down, chest and belly. And again, if it feels right, let's try this 5 times. If it's difficult for you, please breathe in whatever way feels comfortable. But this belly, chest, collarbone, exhale, collarbone, chest, belly. With each breath, let it become a fraction deeper. So that's purely physiologically going to help your body go into rest and digest, versus when the vulnerable self is activated, I'm giving you a lot of information, we can go into sympathetic, a bit charged. Or if you're feeling kind of down or sad today, you might be in what's called dorsal, a little bit slumped. And so this breath just helps your nervous system come back online. And just helps everything get a fraction more calmer, a fraction more present. A couple more breaths, belly, chest, collarbone, chest, belly. If you want to feel a little bit more grounded over time, start to bring in now, this is your third tool, bring in the feeling of what is solid behind you or underneath you. The cushion or the sofa, the ground. The more we connect with what is solid, the more we actually begin to connect with our own solidity and presence right here, which is again, highly grounding. And by grounding, what I mean is anxiety and shame cycle of suffering generally lives in our mind in the future, some terrible future, some hard past. Attention, breath, focusing on solid, something right here brings us into the present moment, which is the only moment. And it's the moment in which we can respond to ourselves rather than be in reaction. Fourth tool, let's come back to that gesture. If you didn't have your hand on heart already, maybe you want to try it, but let's come into a gesture now of nurturance. Hand on heart can be one. Holding our own hands. I know I have clients who really love that, like just a gesture of friendship, holding our own hand. Squeezing, if you're feeling quite a bit of pickup or it's harder to feel you in your body, a nice squeeze at the right level of pressure can be really settling. Some of my clients and I really love hand on face. That's a very tender one. That can be nice. Just playing with it. And holding that. So again, you have your attention, you're still breathing in a special way, or at least a little bit deeper than you would usually, nice and slow. Solidity, gesture, and now last tool, words of affirmation or loving words. In my book, I really guide people through this in my meditations. What does this part right now that's been a big picked up most want to hear? And just note to all of us, is usually pretty simple. And so if you want some ones to try, you can really start as easily as I am here. I'm here with you. I'll give you a few more and just take them or leave them, whatever feels right to you. I'm here with you. It's perfectly okay to feel whatever you feel. I know that you're doing your best. I love you and accept you just as you are, or at least I'm working on it. And then lastly, and this one doesn't require an answer, it's just an invitation. Is there any way that I can help you feel a little bit more at ease right now? I'm right here with you. And just noticing what even begins to happen as you hear these words, because I've found that just hearing them, even if I'm not going through something, is just a natural opening or easing inside. Sometimes it can even just move me to tears. I don't know why. So attention, breath, solidity into the present moment, gesture, and words of affirmation. Those are 5. Little toolkit goes with you everywhere you go. And just notice right now, whatever change it made, perhaps Mark will ask you all to write in that, no judgment, something to use and try.
Anjuli,
how you doing,
thank
Mark?
you. I felt a real sort of one of those kind of tingles down the spine now. And I've seen people talking about feeling tearful. Do you know what I'd love to hear from you in the community here is if you'd be willing to share a taste of a word of affirmation that you might have said to yourself. I mean, you said some lovely ones. I accept you as you are. It's going to be okay. What were some of the small phrases that you found yourself saying? Because I'd love to hear a few of them, because I have a feeling that might create an antidote to what we heard earlier. I am enough. You are safe. I'm at peace. You deserve to be loved. You have courage. I accept you. I've got you. Safe. I cherish you. I hear you. You're doing okay. You are human. All is well. You will be fine. I forgive you. You're okay. You deserve to be here. You are valued. I have faith in you. I'm calm and safe. One step at a time. Just breathe. Oh, I'd love it if people could say that to me every day. That's rather amazing.
Exactly. Oh,
thank you, everyone.
You all are amazing. I knew it. I was like, nurturers. It's right here. And look, I mean, like, you're glowing. I'm glowing. I can't see you all, but I imagine you're glowing. Thank you, everybody. And like you said, Mark, the point is that if you're saying it like this inside, the cycle of suffering and circle of resilience doesn't just exist intrapsychically inside of us, it exists relationally. We do this to each other for worse in the cycle of suffering, and we can change each other's world by, like you said, just going, just breathe, right? I'm sure whoever sees you in your home or mine, seeing me anxious, when they just come over and hold my hand or put a hand on my back or just go, just breathe, it's okay, you're going to do great, I know you're doing your best, I love you. Something else comes out of us, which is already there. It just needs that water of love and attention for our best selves to come out. I'm so moved, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. That makes me optimistic in October.
Yeah, it makes me optimistic.
Makes me optimistic.
I'm often a little bit worried about, you know, this world of promoting happiness and well-being, that we accidentally drift into sort of toxic positivity or naive wishful thinking. Now, with affirmations, you know, I don't think that was us telling ourselves some kind of untruth, some sort of like, you know, wishful thinking. That felt really authentic. It felt like, you know, I'm here for you, just keep breathing, you know. And I think that's what we need. We need a kind of realistic optimism. So it's grounded and it's truthful, but it's also hopeful, and it's sort of asset focused. So I really like that. It feels like really practical as a way forward in difficult times, actually. So yeah, grateful for that. Thank you. So I mean, you gave us some practical things in the exercise. So I really appreciate the kind of, you know, the use of physical touch. I appreciate some of the kind of language we can use with ourselves. How do you build these into your day-to-day life, Anjuli, or indeed when you work with clients? You know, I can imagine in a therapeutic situation, one-to-one with someone who's in a traumatic situation, you can really help. But when we're in our busy days, we're arguing with the kids, we're having a difficult time at work, how do we remember to do this stuff?
Well, I mean, I think when I think about action for happiness, right? I mean, the whole point is it's giving an action step every day. I mean, I believe that is to help wire you differently, because we know that we change through practice. So cycle of suffering, we have practiced these things for a long time, right? Out of our best intentions, but unfortunately with difficult consequences. So what I would say is, again, if we start with that nurturing compassion, which goes, I'm here with you for life. It's you and me. So we have all the time in the world to practice something different. You have a lot of room and time to learn. The reason I began with attention is because attention is the first building block, attention and awareness. So a lot of what we did today and a lot of what you all, I'm sure, are already very immersed in is, we start to wake up to what's happening. Like if I don't even know that I'm in the cycle of suffering, I just think that's life. I'm critical, I'm neglectful, all this, that's just what's happening. It's very hard to change. So awareness is important. And then awareness shifts into change through small actionable steps. So with clients and with myself, starts first with in therapy, or even right now through reading the book or doing meditations, you begin a practice of bringing awareness. That's why I said, like, notice what's happening in sensation. The more you do that, even if you're doing it 10 minutes a day in a meditation or using one of my guided meditations or however you do it, I promise you, you're going to begin to notice yourself more, because that body is talking all day long. One of the tools that I have in my book is called a dial, which makes it ask you to check on yourself a few times a day. And it goes, where are you on this dial in terms of elevated or not? And just that gives you information. Once you have information, you learn how to begin to intervene. Now, I give you a few basic things to intervene. Pausing and taking a breath. I know it sounds so basic, but I promise you, I'm like, 20 something years in. When I'm in a tiff, like you were describing, Mark, like in a rush or wanting to get into it with, someone close to me, keeping my mouth zipped and walking away and breathing has saved so much pain. But just learning how to apply that and knowing that matters, because my nervous system is coming down, is a huge deal. And then we kind of go from there. Then we didn't do this so much, but getting curious is a big part of this work, which is very different than the toxic positivity or bypass. I didn't say, just get happy, everything is good. I said, I want to hear what's going on. So that means I take time to journal. I take time to go on those walks. I begin to ask myself questions. I learn how to listen to my feelings. So that's the kind of longer answer.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really practical way of thinking about it. Thank you. And in the moment, I'm going to come to the questions from the audience. So If you haven't had a chance to put your question yet, please do add it to the Q&A. Or if you'd like to give a thumbs up to another question you'd love to see answered, then we can make sure those ones rise to the top. Just before we go there, though, you said a word to me when we spoke the other day, which I love, about glimmers. And I'd love to hear what you think about glimmers, but this idea that we might just look for little moments that give us a lift in an otherwise maybe quite challenging situation or day. What do glimmers mean to you, and how can we bring those into our lives?
That's right. So yeah, glimmers, it means exactly that, like looking for those little moments and actually actively looking for them, because it is the way our brains work. Whatever we focus on, we begin to see a lot more of. Unfortunately, human beings are wired to focus on negative things. That's just how we are, biology. So we have to actively work. Go, today I'm going to look for, let's say, gratitude has been one, or optimism, like you all have been working on. And then my favorite way of doing that is actually through the senses. I was talking to Mark about on Friday. It had been a really hard week, as you know, in the world and also personally. And as I was just doing my morning practices, all of a sudden I heard a bird chirp outside. And I really do love the sound of birds. And I just began to riff on it. I was like, let me just think about what other sounds I like. And I began to think of the sound of the like tea kettle boiling, and the like crackle and pop of a fire. And as I'm saying this right now, I feel my body start to relax and warm up, or the like purr of a cat when it rubs up against you. The sound of friends or loved ones in another room laughing and having a good time. And I just kind of kept riffing on it. And I love to watch how my nervous system began to relax. And I just remembered what makes life worth living. It was such a tiny thing, a bird chirping. And it brought me into optimism, which didn't mean the world is perfect. It just meant this is why I love the world and why I want to keep on engaging in it. So I use sound. A great way to play with it is choose your favorite sense, sound, touch, scent, sight, and then start to think a little bit about the places that bring you joy or gratitude or love. And as you do that, you just begin to grow that thread. You begin to see it more. And then if you want to really take an action to deepen it, share it. Because it's one thing when we feel it inside, it's another thing when we say it out loud, and then it's another thing when we see someone else light up because of it. And that is how, it's one tiny way of beginning to actively see glimmers to regulate our system. In our circle of resilience, that would be the nurture or the soul self going, come on, let's open this up. Let's turn to something that brings you joy or warmth or gratitude as a way of re-enlivening you. And it's going to help you.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Thank you. I love that phrase, glimmers. We've got quite a lot of really good questions here. So let's try and spend just a minute or two on each of these.
Sure.
So first of all, Charlotte's asked a question that I know lots of people are dealing with health challenges, and she's just said, how can resilience help me handle my chronic health anxieties better? A lot of people with chronic health challenges.
Thank you so much for asking that. I work a lot with people with chronic illness, and I think that in our time the past few years has been such a big thing, we all are holding. I'm going to keep it to our cycle, because I think with chronic illness, if you think there's the vulnerable self and it's in pain, and a lot of times with chronic illness, we are in bed or we're alone, and it really is a lot about what's happening inside. So I think anything we can do to shift, to watch out for if we're in critic or the neglector, and to actually even bring the nurturer to that. Because when we're in pain, when I'm in pain, my voice, it gets hard. And of course I want to distract and get away from. And I think it is actually permissioning to be like, it's okay to want to get away. And at the same time, if I can make my inner voice as nurturing as possible, and or turn to, I know with pain, turning to meditations, turning to someone else's voice, bringing in that nurturance can be really soothing for pain. So really actively focusing on that part to help care for it will be the beginning cornerstone. And thank you for bringing that, because there's warriors that take on chronic pain. It's a brave and vulnerable place to be.
Emily has asked if you could explain a bit more about setting boundaries. So we gave an example earlier on about being able to say no. Are there any other examples of how we can sort of be more boundaried in our lives?
Yeah, so boundaries begin with consent, right? Yes, no, maybe. And I again, like, walk people through this in the book, and in the meditations, you'll find a lot of tools around energetic boundaries, as well as beginning to verbalize boundaries. But maybe a tiny place I'll begin to recap from our session is the beginning of a boundary is even paying attention to when you notice the urge for it come up in your body, because it is so scary to actually set a boundary verbally. I don't start there with clients. I start first with like, when do you even notice there's actually a no inside? Because most people are so used to bypassing it that it's a whole other thing to say it to somebody else. It's first to recognize within myself, oh, I did get a little cringy inside, or I got a bit tight, or tension came up, or I found myself avoiding that phone call or text. And it's like, oh, those are signs that maybe I need something. So starting with attention. And then what I would say to you is I'm beginning to practice without ever having to say anything to anybody else. So with my clients, somatically, I practice saying no in different ways. Those are places that I would start. And again, you'll find a lot more detail in the book. And it's a great question. And again, lots of time and compassion for yourself and practice.
Steve has asked about where we draw the line between the sort of neglector or trying to sort of, I guess, push away difficult things with how we engage with those, I guess, important issues that are often beyond our control, like war or climate change and so on. How does our resilience relate to these kind of almost existential things going on around us?
That's right. Well, first of all, again, what I would say is it is overwhelming to turn to those things, and that is nobody's fault or no lessness in us. Those things are huge, and we're already struggling so much in our personal lives that it is completely understandable to be like, I just want to tune this out. And of course, depending upon our place in life and the privileges we have, it might actually be easier to tune it out. And of course, because we are, like I said, it's obvious, we are this kind, nurturing community. I don't think any of us want to tune it out. We just don't know how to come back in and do something. So from the compassionate viewpoint, giving ourselves time and space to be able to, expand our bandwidth by basically like, it's okay to take a breather. It's okay to turn off the news. It's okay to do some of those things the soul self is offering and the nurturing self to be able to build ourselves up. The difference really would be is if we're always engaging in distraction to the point that we never turn back, then we probably are we are away from engagement. That's not necessarily we're in our resilience. We are actually somewhat in avoidance or overwhelm. And if that happens, just know that it probably you need more support internally to feel a bit more cared for, to then hopefully be able to go in bite-sized ways, in ways that actually I can handle. I am going to turn back. Maybe so it doesn't have to be the news. It could be engaging in ways like the soul self, movements, communities, voting, actually engaging in a cause versus just inundating yourself with news around the world. So it's about choosing how you're going to engage so it doesn't overwhelm your system, while also giving yourself lots of compassion for being overwhelmed in the first place. It's a big question, so I am sorry. I'm doing my best to answer them in very bite-sized pieces. Please forgive me. I know I'm missing a lot of.
No, it's lovely to hear you responding to difficult questions, but in such a kind of holistic and thoughtful way. And I had my own existential issue there with the complete loss of internet connection while you were speaking. So I'm glad to be back with you again. We're running out of time, but the last question I'm going to have time for today, because I would love us to do a little exercise before we finish. Tenzin has asked, how can individuals contribute to resilience and healing in our workplaces or our communities and create more of a sort of sense of network? And I guess maybe this comes back to what you were saying about this being part of a community and the Action for Happiness sort of idea as well. But what do you think about building resilience with others?
A lot. And in fact, one thing you'll find in my book is written a little bit differently than other books on resilience in terms of it is talking about the individual, but it's very much saying, and now what relationally and now what collectively. So in the workplace, what I will say to you is a lot of my clients, a lot of the hurt and harm that's happening is in the workplace, right? And so what I would say is depending upon, first of all, how much leverage you have. Now, certainly if you're listening to this and you have any power, you're a member of a union, you're a manager, you're a supervisor, you lead a team, right there, the things I talked about, how do you become more of the nurturer? So how do you attune more? How do you listen? How do you make sure that you actually are attending to the needs of your team as human beings and not just as productive cogs inside of a system? Any power that we have, whether we're teachers, even I as like a therapist, like how do I treat my clients? What are my policies? We're always looking to treat people as human beings and helping them to feel more nurtured and protected. Again, much longer conversation, and I do hope the book gives you some good ideas.
Yeah, so thank you again for this book, which I've really enjoyed. Tomorrow we're going to send around a link to obviously that, but also these free resources that you're kindly sharing and your own website where people can find out more. Before I turn to you for a final word, Anjuli, I'd just like to suggest that we do together at this sort of community gathering what we call the Action for Happiness checkout, which is a lovely way of sort of ending our time together. So wherever you are right now, if you just like to take a pause and just take a breath, and just to notice how you're feeling right now, having been in this space with these lovely other humans, and especially with Anjuli for the last hour or so, and all the things that have come up both inside of you and also in this conversation, and these lovely questions and all the great chat. And just holding in mind that, bring to mind something you appreciate or something you might want to take away from this time together, something that you've really valued or something that you just has sort of made you smile. And in a moment, I'll invite you to perhaps share some of those things. But just while we're in this moment of meditation, bringing that sense of appreciation and sending that out to where we really need that in the world right now. So there are so many people in need of more resilience, more happiness, and let's send out a sense of warm wishing to other parts of the world, to others who perhaps can't be here and who aren't currently part of a community like this, but perhaps could benefit from it in the future. So with that sense of well-wishing, if you'd just love to share your appreciation in a few words in the chat, both for Anjuli, but also in terms of what you might want to take away from this session. It's always so lovely to be together. So I'll just read a few of these out. It's great to connect with like-minded people. Thank you so much to feel part of something. I think there's a sense of this being a non-religious community. I saw someone say, very optimistic. Thank you for the information. Love and light. Glad to be with you all. So many of your ideas, I think, are going to be taken away and used in people's lives, Anjuli. So we really appreciate you. I'd love to invite you perhaps to leave us with a final thought before we part. How would you like to sort of sum up this topic and our time together?
Well, firstly, just thank you, everybody. I opened the chat so I can see, and I just am so moved by all of you. I mean, I think the way I would sum it up right now is this is the optimism we need in our world. I needed this as well, that like hundreds and hundreds of you showed up, and I see your voices on the chat. And like, I think we need to know from each other, the world is a cycle of suffering, or it can be a circle of resilience. And I hope that this work that we're doing lets us walk out, whether it's into the next bedroom with partners or children or family, or into the workplaces, or into the PTA, or into the voting booth, wherever you're going, that we show up with these voices, and we become the nurturer for each other and the protector, upholding the right and dignity of each other to feel safe and loved and good and allowed to thrive. I think if we do that, there's such a deep optimism that can return. And I just am really, really grateful to all of you for showing up and reminding me there's such a lot of wonderful humans on this planet. And I'm so happy to be a part of the human community. I'm very touched. Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for doing this.
Well, thank you, Anjuli. We have a pledge in the Action Happiness community that says, I pledge to create more happiness and less unhappiness in the world. And we can each do that in our own little way. And you've certainly inspired us with new ideas to how to put that pledge into practice for ourselves, but also for those around us as part of this community. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's contributed and been part of this today. See you all again soon for another live event. Thank you.
Bye.